Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inspiring Hope. I'm your host, Lois Hermann, and I'm here to shine the light on people who are making a difference in our world. And today I'm really honored to welcome Hans Jackson, a dedicated historian, past state president of the Sons of the American Revolution, and a true patriot. Hans brings a wealth of knowledge about our revolutionary roots. You know, I talk about the American Revolution as a daughter of the American Revolution and participating in a lot of the different events with the Sons of the American Revolution. And I just love to listen to Hans. He's not necessarily a acclaimed historian, but I look at him as a font of historical knowledge, stories he tells that most people are not aware of. So I'm glad to have you here with me today, Hans. So first, tell us a little bit about what inspired you to get involved in the genealogy and the American Revolution. How did you get started in all of this?
Well, it actually started with my father taking an early retirement, and he took up genealogy as a hobby.
Okay.
And through that, we literally knew nothing about our ancestry.
Okay.
My father would tell me things like, well, we're German, we have this. And I'm like, well, is that where Hans came from? Where did Jackson come from? How did you come up with this combination?
Right.
And so through his genealogy research and pursuits, which was at that time, there was nothing online. So you could not do any online research. Everything was boots on the ground. I had moved into Connecticut and then after that into New Hampshire. And I became his guy to go to the town secretaries and the clerk's offices and find the documents that he had said, we believe the family lived in this area, see what you can find. And gradually we pulled that all together. And that actually became, my father had quite a library when he passed of all of both on my mother's side and my father's side. So it was his hobby, and I became a part of that, and it was a way for me to interact with him.
Nice. Really nice. And then you've gone on. I mean, between the Sons of the American Revolution, you also raised your children as the children in the organization, the children of the American Revolution too, right?
Yes, that's true. Both my children were national presidents of the organization. First from New Hampshire, my daughter holding the title first. And with each presidency, they have a project that they do. And my daughter's project was raising monies for the Museum of the American Revolution. And it was prior to its opening, and she raised over $100,000.
Wow.
That went to the preservation of George Washington's tent that's at the center of the museum, and also for the education pieces of it. My son, in turn, went for the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown, which was newly reopening, and he raised around $90,000 for that, and those monies went to buying siege artillery. So he bought 2 pieces of artillery for them with his donation, and they put on a siege exhibit for a full year there at the museum.
So I'm going to interrupt you for those of us who are not as familiar. What is siege artillery? Please explain.
So that's any cannon piece. It could be mortars. When you're in siege tactics, you're basically using a lot of artillery because you're not able to do infantry movements very easily. Everybody's entrenched.
Gotcha.
So you're just using the cannon and mortars, and the mortars would actually be explosive projectiles. So they would actually be filled with gunpowder, be put into the mortar, be sent over and then explode. So they had those that type of artillery and weaponry at the time.
Interesting. I just did. We're kind of following the 250th anniversary, and I just did a little podcast about the Lexington and Concord situation, and then after that, the siege of Boston by the colonists on Boston. And so that kind of brings us. Before we get off on to our topic du jour, I also want to give a huge shout out to your wife, Trish Jackson, who is, oh my goodness, so involved with the Daughters of the American Revolution as state regent in the past and regent for our Molly Stark chapter. So she's your whole family is incredibly involved and an inspiration. So
No, we've enjoyed it. It's been a family pursuit, and when you can do things as a family, it obviously makes a lot of things easier than we had the sports and we had the education and things
right.
like that, but this was something we did in common, and everybody seemed to enjoy.
I agree. It's when my husband and I, my husband Kurt, we met dancing. So our entertainment was dancing. And then when COVID hit, we didn't go dancing anymore. And that's when we started getting involved in the Daughters and the Sons of the American Revolution. So traveling with him to these different events is a way of being with my spouse and us being together. It's also for me an incredible opportunity for learning. I think I have learned more in the past few years about our country from living historians like yourself than I ever learned in the history books in school. So with that said, let's take this whole story. The siege has happened now in our timeline. The colonists have laid siege to the redcoats, the Revolutionary War, the British soldiers in Boston. And what happens? Take us up to what happens before we dive into Bunker Hill. Give us a sense of the political and emotional climate among the people in the colonies at the time, especially New Hampshire. So it would be 1775. What motivated people to get involved?
So in 75, you actually have a couple of different situations going on. You have the Lexington and Concord, so you have the British Army actually firing upon the citizenry of
Mm-hmm.
this country. So that takes it to a very inflamed point. People who may have been saying, well, I'm not really sure where my loyalties stand, are now persuaded to say, listen, they're killing our own people. They're supposed to be here to protect us. Our rights are being trampled on. So they take up arms and they amass. In New Hampshire, you have a situation where New Hampshire is basically in a situation that they're taking over the government already. So you have Fort William and Mary that has occurred. And again, for your audience who don't know, General Gage out of Boston, we're sending in the Redcoats up to Newcastle, New Hampshire, because there was gunpowder there. Paul Revere made his ride from Boston to Portsmouth to alert the Sons of Liberty. We went out, raided the fort, and assaulted the fort, took the gunpowder, struck the king's colors. This is an assault on a king's installation. So this is treason.
And yet there was no bloodshed in that. There was treason, but nobody
No
was
blood.
injured or there was no deaths
Yep,
anyway.
exactly. I mean, what you had is you have a real situation there where you have people inside the fort that are protecting everything, and the people outside the fort, they know each other. They're neighbors.
Neighbors.
So I mean, their interactions are such that they don't necessarily they want to kill their neighbor.
Mhm.
So I mean, but that ensues, and New Hampshire's at a point right now where it's really looking like the royal governor is going to be taken out, and that eventually happens. But in response to Lexington and Concord, New Hampshire amasses its forces and goes down to Medford, John Stark, General Reed. So you have first and the second New Hampshire being formed. And we actually have the most men than any colony at the Battle of Bunker Hill.
So I
So,
don't know if people know a lot about General John Stark. I'm very familiar with him,
yeah.
but a thimbleful compared to you. So could you tell us a little bit about who is John Stark? I mean, those of us who know about the tagline for New Hampshire, "Live Free or Die." Many people don't know the rest of that line,
Right.
and that came from General John Stark. So can you tell us a little bit about John Stark?
So John Stark, whose family comes here from, they're part of the Scots-Irish migration.
Okay.
And they come into Nutfield, New Hampshire, which is Londonderry, New Hampshire. He resides there with his father, and then they moved to Derryfield, which is now Manchester, New Hampshire, and that's where he ends up. His father builds a home, and he eventually builds a home after a French and Indian War. He's an outdoorsman. He is a trapper. He is very at home in the frontier and in the wilderness.
Mm.
Early on in his life, he's on a trapping expedition up north in New Hampshire. He is captured by Abenaki warriors. He and another man from New Hampshire. They're taken north, and he had this. I wouldn't call him abrasive, but he was very much firm in his beliefs and how he saw himself and how he did things. A quick anecdote on the capture of him by the Abenaki. At the time, they're made to run a gauntlet. So the braves are lined up. They've got club sticks, whatever. And the first gentleman, I think it was Eastman, he's made to run it. He gets beaten very severely. It's John Stark's turn to run it. He attacks the first brave in line, takes the club, and starts thrashing his way down through. They parted, let him go. Later on, he is actually adopted into the Abenaki,
Mm-hmm.
but then he is released. A group is sent, and they parley with them and the French, and he's released back down here. So he ends up in the French and Indian War, part of Rogers' Rangers. And the Ranger Corps were basically frontiersmen. Robert Rogers was a neighbor of John's. They grew up in Londonderry together, and then later on, the Rogers family settled in what was called Starkstown at the time, now Dunbarton, New Hampshire.
Okay.
But he serves in the Ranger Corps, and in the Ranger Corps, it's where they learn how to do. It's more guerrilla warfare type of
More like
action.
the Native American, the Native
Exactly.
Americans would have been how they would have fought, not like the lined up British
Exactly.
I mean, they're the old European armies. They would line up shoulder to shoulder and shoot at each other in an open field. But that is not how Rogers
No,
Ranger.
the Rangers had their own set of rules, and they would maneuver themselves, and they were basically using to get behind enemy lines, to look at, to report back, take a captive, gather information. So they were doing a lot of that, and that's where he learned a lot of being an officer and a soldier.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, kind of leads up to the Battle of Bunker Hill. The third Viscount Howe comes to North America, and he wants to learn how they conduct themselves as Rangers and how they do everything. And so he meets with John Stark. The next day, the Viscount is killed in a battle, but his brothers are the Admiral and the General Howes that come to North America, and General Howe is put in charge of all British forces in North America, and the Admiral is in charge of all the Navy, British Navy, and they're at Boston. So they learned that. And then you had another gentleman who actually was also an officer from the British in the French and Indian War, and he would have known of Stark too, and that was General John Burgoyne. And we'll save that story for another day, because that's part of the Battle of Bennington and the Saratoga retreat.
Right. Well, definitely. Can we just do one little backup? Most people, the average American, have no idea what the French and Indian War is. Many people think it's the French and Indians were fighting against each other, and can you explain a little bit about what the French and Indian War was?
Yeah, so this is actually the European 7 Years' War.
Okay.
And it is a war between the French and the British. So they are fighting each other for the different colonies, different land territories, and because they are competing against each other for getting control over certain areas that have raw materials that they want.
Okay. Yeah.
In North America, that becomes French Canada fighting against the British colonies, which included all the 13 colonies. And a lot of that fighting took place in upstate New York, around Lake George area into Quebec. So that's what happened. And then eventually the British went out at Quebec, Battle of Quebec, and they seized all of the territory. But you still have a French population that reside there because they've been there for years. Families have. So,
and for people to also recognize that Vermont was actually a part of New Hampshire at the time. It was almost
correct.
Like a territory that was kind of embattled between New York and New Hampshire. There was
Yep.
some state infighting going on there too,
Yep.
because of governors giving land grants from two different states to these poor people who
Yeah.
are building their homes. I mean, there was a lot of interesting
Yep.
challenges that the people faced
Yep.
politically, and just establishing a homestead that
Yep.
was only part of their challenge.
Yeah, Vermont, before it becomes a state, is a colony. It's colonial territory. That's first Massachusetts said it was their land. Then later, the royal governor of New Hampshire, Benning Wentworth, sold the land to people from basically Connecticut who came up the Connecticut River and settled there. My family was one of them. And then later, New York said, wait a minute, that's not their land. And they petitioned the crown, and the crown said, no, actually, that land belongs to New York. And that leads up to how the Green Mountain Boys were formed. A lot of people think the Green Mountain Boys are a Revolutionary War unit that was formed. They were actually formed prior to the Revolution. And the reason for that was New York said, listen, you can stay here. You just have to pay. We know you paid New Hampshire, but now you have to pay us.
Hmm. How
And so
unfair is that? Yeah.
exactly. So the Green Mountain Boys were formed to run off the tax collectors, the sheriffs from New York back to New York so that they could keep their land.
Mhm.
And then later, when the revolution broke out, they formed into a unit and then participated at the Battle of Bennington along with other things.
Sure.
But yeah, they were paramilitary prior to the revolution.
It's amazing all of the different things, the different societal and political things that were going on back then. And again, like you said, these were neighbors, people fighting against neighbors, not unlike what's going on today, really, where people have such widely different opinions. And then so this leads to what happened. Bunker Hill was a victory and a defeat at the same time, right? So
Right.
can you give us a sense of what happened? Many people associate Bunker Hill with Massachusetts, and yet New Hampshire forces played a critical role, didn't they?
They absolutely did. So on June 17th, cannonades are being fired by the British from floating rafts, from vessels, and from proper Boston proper through cannon, and they're besieging it. At that point in time, General Howe makes a decision, and they're going to do a direct frontal assault on the colonial forces. They are repelled multiple times. While this is all happening, John Stark he's at Medford, where his headquarters are and all his men are. He makes a unilateral decision that he's going to march his men across the field of battle because as I mentioned, he's aware of the Howe brothers. He's aware of their tactics. He
Mm.
knows that General Howe has always in his battle situations after following frontal assaults will make a flanking maneuver. The colonial forces were without any protection on their flank. So Stark takes it upon himself, and he's colonel at this time of the 1st New Hampshire, and he marches his men across and takes up along a rail fence and along the Mystic River. That's the tide is out. So there's places there for them to march up on the riverbanks. He sets himself there. And a lot of people have heard about William Prescott and the call for the don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. I also mentioned that Prescott was a ranger of the French and Indian War.
Okay.
So he learned his tactics from people like John Stark, who was a captain of Rangers, and Robert Rogers, who was the major of the Ranger Corps. So Stark takes up his position. He walks out. He lays a stake in the ground, tells his men that we do not fire until they cross this line. And when we fire at the whites of their crossbelts.
Part of the reason for that is they were low on ammunition. They were low on gunpowder. Is that correct?
Yep, that is correct. And actually, New Hampshire had more gunpowder and used it more conservatively due to that point. But John Stark actually outfitted most of his men with powder that he had purchased.
Okay.
So they make and a number of his men are hardened Rangers, so they came from the Ranger Corps. So he knows these men. They're not individuals who are participating in their first battle.
Right.
So because of that, the nerves aren't there. They know exactly what to do. They know the commands. And they're not going to just act out of fear.
One of the other things that I had heard is that during this time there was not a combined United or a
Correct.
colonial force. They were different state factions, and so
Exactly.
they were not unified because it wasn't. We talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the battle was actually fought on Breed's Hill. Is that not correct? Can you explain? Because there were certain troops that left the
Yeah.
battle. I mean, it was sort of a mess, wasn't it?
It was because you did have multiple commanders. You had General Elizabeth Putnam from Connecticut. You had General Joseph Warren, who actually was appointed a general, but he had decided to fight as a soldier when they built the redoubt, and he was down in the redoubt, and he was actually, when the redoubt was overrun, was killed. But he was the spy master of Massachusetts. A lot of people don't know about his background, but he was constantly working and he was promoting liberty. He was promoting things. So he was a very activist. A lot of people hear about Sam Adams, but really Warren was the big proponent, and he was highly educated and, was a big part of that.
Was he the
He,
doctor? Was he a
he is
doctor?
the doctor. Yeah, he was a doctor.
When you say these things that I have, my friends were like, "What's a readout?" Can you
Yep.
mention these things like you know what they are, but the average listener is like, "What?"
Yep. So a redoubt was typically a earthworks that would be built for a defensive position, and that way they could fire from a defensive position with protections. And that was actually what was built down on Breeds Hill, because I forget who made that decision. I don't know if that was Putnam or Prescott, but one of them made that decision to place it there. It was actually within cannon fire. It was not a good positioning. It was not the high ground. The Bunker Hill was the high ground where they should have put things, and made, because what you have, this is June 17th. It's hot. The British are in full uniform. They're in wool. They're carrying all their weaponry. They're having to march uphill.
Mhm.
So, I mean, when you take that all into account, you want to be at the high point because you want them to be exhausted.
Mhm.
And I mean, because of the nature of what it was, we were able to repel them. And eventually, what it broke down to was that we were out of gunpowder.
Mm.
So certain groups, especially in the redoubt, ran out of gunpowder. Some of them quit the redoubt and retreated. Some stayed, Joseph Warren being one of them. And this is where Stark's Rangers really come into play,
Mhm.
because Stark is, as I said, he's told his men to conserve it. You don't fire until this. The Welsh Fusiliers are attacking his flank, trying to make a flanking maneuver. He repels them multiple times. At the time the redoubt is starting to be overrun, he sees it's going to be overrun. His Rangers then put down a retreating maneuver, which is one line fires, it falls behind the next line. The front line fires, it falls behind the next line. So you're controlling the rate of which the British are getting to you, and they're not going to overrun you. And because of that, he really saves the day
And you know what?
for
One of the
this.
things that oftentimes people think of as well, the colonists are disorganized, et cetera. They used a lot of very fascinating tactics. They were, different factions were disorganized or as a whole, but a lot of the tactics and maneuvers they used were really brilliant. But it was different than what the British were used to using. And
Yes.
that's why they were being outgunned or
Yeah.
outmaneuvered, shall we
Yeah,
say.
we were not going to come out and face them on an open field of battle in line. I mean, that just, it made no sense. We didn't have the gunpowder, we didn't have the weaponry.
Mhm.
So we fought it in the manner that we knew how to fight, and the Ranger Corps, really, for those men that were in the Ranger Corps, understood what that meant.
Sure.
So you had Prescott, you had McClary, Major McClary, who was a Ranger. He was an officer of Rangers. Yeah, obviously John Stark. Putnam was a Ranger in the French Indian War out of Connecticut. So they were very well educated in those types of tactics.
And they were fighting with the British against the French in the
That's correct. That's
war.
correct.
That's
Yep.
correct. So here you've got people who were fighting shoulder to shoulder with the British just years before, and now they're fighting against the British.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, it causes conflict within families. You have actually John Stark's oldest brother becomes a colonel in the British Army.
Really?
Yeah,
Hmm.
he was a captain of Rangers as well, and at the outset, he he I think he petitioned colony. They didn't really believe him because I don't think he'd always shown loyalty to the crown
Mhm.
and to Parliament. So they would not give him an officer's position, and he ends up as a colonel in the British Army.
Hmm.
So you have two brothers that are, in conflict.
And the colonists back then thought initially they all considered themselves British,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
on
I
American
mean,
soil.
the intention of things like the Bunker Hill was not necessarily to fight to establish ourselves as an independent nation. It was to react to what was a military treatment of the citizenry that caused us to fear for our lives. It was to send a message about we want equal representation and that we're not to be taken for granted. And it was also about commerce. I mean, because you had a lot of raw materials that were leaving this country or being used, plus you had all these taxes placed upon things that we were bringing into country.
Mhm.
A lot of that stemmed from actually the French and Indian War because Parliament felt that North America, its colonies, had not paid its due for the British forces coming here to defend us against the French. So they felt that, they had a war debt and they had to make up for that. So they instead put taxes on their colonies.
Hmm.
And that when it became about commerce and goods, I mean, that hurt everybody.
Sure,
So
sure.
it wasn't just the rich, it wasn't just the poor, it was everybody.
Right. Wow. So what happens if so Stark helps to save Bunker Hill, but
Yep,
it actually goes down in history as a victory for the
the
British. Is
British. Yep. So overall, because we quit the ground, it's labeled a victory for the British, but the number of wounded and casualties inflicted upon the British
that? Mhm.
was so great that it was absolutely a moral victory for the colonists.
Right.
And I forget which British officer said it, but he said if we have to uh, win more battles in this manner, we'll never survive.
Right. Because there were thousands of casualties on the British. It mind boggles me to think of that many. They would have to walk over their dead and
Yeah,
wounded in order to engage in battle.
yeah,
It's horrific what these people had to go through. It really is.
yeah.
Yeah. So how does this affect? What do you think the message would be for younger generations who learn from? What can we learn from the Battle of Bunker Hill and the American Revolution in general?
I think you have the scenario that you have your ideals, you have how you view yourself as a citizen, and that was part of why we said no to a parliament and we said no to the royal to the king. We wanted to have control over how we conducted ourselves in commerce, how we conducted ourselves within the government. If we had been established and had equal representation and had a seat at the table in parliament, maybe none of this had happened. But because we were treated unequally, first it was about, we're not going to buy the goods. We're going to get rid of those goods. The Boston Tea Party, with other tea parties across. A lot of people don't know there were tea parties that happened in most of the colonies. Trying to send a message, but at a point in time where either you're not heard or your life and livelihood is being impacted by a tyrannical force,
Mhm.
then you have to make that decision, what you're willing and able to do.
Absolutely. So you've done a lot of in research, both in genealogy and in the American Revolution, as a part of the Sons of the American Revolution. So what is this battle, the Battle of Bunker Hill? was at an event and was listening to the speaker, and you were sitting there nodding the whole time. I'm like, yeah, what does this mean to you? What is this? Is a significant milestone, and why is it relevant to you today?
I think it really is a pivot point in history where we go from a point of basically speaking out, filing petitions, filing things, to a point of to show that sometimes the force is needed to send a message. Unfortunately, war is never good. But at some point, it made me it's a sense of pride that you had a group of farmers, merchants, doctors, that were willing to defend themselves against a force that meant to quell their liberties and basically designate them as a treasonous group.
It's awful what they went through and the sacrifices that they made. And to me, personally, we need to honor, respect, and pay attention to that. And lest we repeat this. I mean, how many times do we have to go to war? When is this going to stop? The whole concept was we're going to fight. This is going to be done, and then we turn around and have another war. So, how do you feel being involved with the Sons of the American Revolution? How is that? How can you see that affecting our decision making today?
Well, I think part of that is promoting that history, keeping that history alive, and letting the younger people know, what our history is, why things happen. It wasn't just about a single battle. It was about the public sentiment. It was about different aspects of laws and things that were occurring. So, I mean, all those things are good to know because knowing that, I think, makes a person a better citizen. I think it also makes you top of mind that, really going to fight and to battle in war is the last thing that you want to do, and that what it takes to drive the people to that point. So with that knowledge, you can then take up other facets to speak your voice and let yourself be heard as a populace, and try to quell things before they reach that type of situation.
Beautiful. I have one other question, and next week is Flag Day.
Yes.
And the flag is being part of sometimes I carry the flag with the color guard, and I've learned a bit about the flag, and many people are not quite aware of the significance of the flag. And my background, I grew up on military bases, so there was always such an incredible respect for the flag. It's not a worship of the flag, but there's a respect for the flag. And back in the Revolutionary days, the flag was a rallying point. It was also used for messaging. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of the flag in the American Revolution?
Yeah, so you actually had a number of flags that were flown before the Betsy Ross flag becomes the official flag for the nation, its military forces. And flags were flown, and they would be representative of the regional areas. So in New England, you'd oftentimes see a flag with a pine tree on it because masking the pines was what was done here. That was a big resource. Other parts, you'll see appeal to heaven, and that was, to say, we have a divine right to our freedom and our liberties. The red, white, and blue comes from the red is the blood that was shed. The white is for the purity, and the blue is for the constellation and the stars in the constellation. These were while soldiers, they were still very many deeply religious from different religious groups that served throughout the revolution. And part of that knowledge base and their faith was what drove them to understand that they saw this as also a moral type of situation that we had to address, and how we had to conduct ourselves, and to really set up a nation where God was a part of that. Although the religion is kept out of government, but you have a lot of the learnings from the Bible and other religious sources that go into how they form their governing documents. So yeah, the flag was absolutely was used for the men to form up on, was what led it into the vanguard to lead the men into battle. It was a rallying point, and if a flag was taken by the enemy, that was truly a defeat.
Mm-hmm. That was a sign of defeat. Is just like at Fort William and Mary, that there were no shots fired or no bloodshed, but the flag was struck. The flag was taken down, which
Yes.
we
Yeah,
now own, and we captured the fort.
Yep. That was honestly, people don't think of that as being such a big deal, but it was.
Was a big deal.
Oh yeah.
That's also why I think we had gunpowder.
Yeah.
Because we rescued the gunpowder from Fort William and Mary, and from what I understand, it was stored in different places around the country, around New Hampshire, sometimes in the churches, underneath the pulpits, and different places, so that when they needed it, evidently several of those barrels that were stored from Fort William and Mary ended up being used at the Battle of Bunker Hill. I've heard. So.
We don't know it factually, but we think that the lore is yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So the Battle of Bunker Hill is coming up in a couple weeks. Next week,
June 17th is the 250th anniversary of the battle, and it's also the bicentennial 200th anniversary of the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument.
Wow. Okay.
And New Hampshire has a tie there as well, because the great orator Daniel Webster from New Hampshire gave the oration at the laying of that cornerstone.
Yeah, it's very interesting how so many people were involved, even though it was quite a distance. I mean, how long would it have taken Stark and his men to get to Boston? They would have had, and they're walking, right? Some of them might have horses, but they're walking. So here they are. The alarms go out from riders, and they had such a network of communication. We've got our phones and stuff like that, but they had ways of communicating with each other back then that were very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, the alarm from Lexington got here very quickly. Men quickly formed up their groups, and towns were sending 30, 40, 50 men in multiple companies, and they went down, and then they would meet up with Stark, and Stark would form them into the 1st New Hampshire, and then some of them would be in the 2nd, and then New Hampshire men actually formed with Connecticut units as well as Massachusetts units to fill out their numbers. And again, I mean, a lot of these, they were family members. You had people from Massachusetts and New Hampshire who were related to each other, so you were fighting side by side your cousin. So
interesting times, and it's interesting to learn about the origins of our history, so that we can be, I like the way you said that we can be better citizens, better informed, and have respect for what our ancestors went through. That's the beautiful thing about attending these grave markings and these other ceremonies, is having a respect for what people have been through, and not just take it for granted. Any last thoughts, sir, that you'd like to share before we wrap up today?
Well, you mentioned Stark, and you mentioned his toast to his compatriots at the victory of the Battle of Bennington, when he was infirmed and could not attend an anniversary event. And his toast to them was, "Live free or die. Death is not the greatest of evils."
The inference was slavery and servitude is greater evil than death, right?
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for being the historian that you are. And we just have to keep getting these messages out so that people can know more about our true history.
Welcome, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Until next time, I'd like to ask everybody to look up, stay positive, and bring the light to someone today. See you next time. Please share. Bye for now.